Imagine walking through the great halls of Topkapi Palace, where golden domes gleam under a Turkish sun, and marble courtyards echo the footsteps of vanished royalty. Behind thick velvet curtains and latticed golden doors lies another world, one you want to find on tourist maps or in high school textbooks. This isn't the world of the sultans, or even of the concubines you may have heard of, the women kept behind silken screens. No, this is the world of the kek, boys, mostly foreign, mostly stolen, raised to please, trained to obey, and ordered to be beautiful. The Ottoman Empire spanned centuries, from the 1300s to the early 20th century. At its height, it controlled parts of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. It was a colossus of power, art, and wealth. But behind its palaces and military might lay something far darker. In the gilded shadows of its court, certain boys were groomed not to rule, not to fight, not to think, but to entertain. And by entertain, we don't mean court jesters. We mean pleasure objects. The kek were often young boys dressed in ornate, flowing fabrics, robes woven with silver, sleeves white and elegant, lips painted red, cheeks rouged, hair perfumed. They were dancers. They were servants. And sometimes they were more. They danced in harems and courtyards. They were passed between noblemen as gifts, and many were castrated to preserve their youthful looks, their androgynous charm. But this wasn't some small, private shame. The kek were celebrities. They were adored in public, and just as quickly, they were discarded. For centuries, their lives were filled with adoration and torment, luxury and fear, music and mutilation. Most of them never left the palace, and most of them have been forgotten. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear the soft jingle of their anklets in the dark corners of history. And tonight, we pull back the curtain. To understand how a child becomes a concubine in the Ottoman Empire, you have to begin not in the palace, but in the distant corners of empire. Villages tucked into the mountains of Albania, or cobblestone streets in Georgia, or the riverbanks of Armenia. Places where, one day, your child might simply vanish. The Ottoman state called it the Verma system of forced recruitment, sometimes called the blood tax. Every few years, the Sultan's agents would sweep through Christian territories under Ottoman control and take the boys. Yes, take, without consent, sometimes without warning. A child as young as 8 might be ripped from his mother's arms, bundled into a cart, and carried hundreds of miles away. The official story: they were being trained for the empire. Many of these boys went on to become soldiers, janissaries, or officials in the Ottoman court. But not all of them were so lucky. You see, some of these boys weren't chosen for their strength or intellect. They were chosen for their faces. Men, yes, grown men inspected these children for beauty. Soft features, delicate hands, fair skin, large, dark eyes. They weren't looking for soldiers. They were looking for something else. And if you weren't taken through the verb, you might be sold instead, because the Ottoman Empire had a vast, organized slave market, not in secret, but out in the open, and it wasn't limited to Africans. White slaves from Eastern Europe, Circassia, Greece, and the Caucasus were highly prized, especially if they were young and beautiful. Some boys were war captives, others were the children of debtors. Still others were simply kidnapped by raiders and smugglers who sold them to the empire as wealthy elite. They would pass through bazaars where merchants shouted prices over naked children. They were cleaned, perfumed, and dressed up like dolls, and then like livestock they were sold. What happened next depended entirely on who bought you. If it was a merchant or nobleman, you might end up in a household, serving tea or fetching shoes. If it was a palace eunuch, you might be groomed in every sense of the word. That's when the real transformation began. These weren't just boys anymore. They were investments, and their value came from obedience, silence, and how well they could be trained to please. In some regions, young boys were handed over by their own families, desperate for survival under the empire. Others were stolen and sold like treasures. But no matter how it started, it always ended the same way. Your name was stripped. Your religion was erased. Your voice was no longer your own. And your body belonged to the empire. Once a boy had been selected, whether through diverm or slave market, The next decision was cruel and final. If his buyer wanted him to become a concubine, a kek, or a servant in the royal harem, the boy would be castrated. It was called hadman. It was far more than a surgical procedure. It was a sentence. Castration was used by ancient civilizations, Romans, Chinese, Persians, but in the Ottoman Empire, it took on a particular brutality. There were no hospitals, no anesthesia, no modern medicine. Most commonly, both the penis and the testicles were removed completely. The wound was cauterized, sometimes packed with ash. If the child survived, which many didn't, they were bled, bandaged, and left to recover in silence. These children, some just 9 or 10, lay shaking in straw beds, not knowing if they would live through the night. If they did, their bodies were forever changed, their hormones disrupted, their growth stunted. They would never reach puberty. No beard, no deep voice. Their skin remained soft, smooth. Their frames stayed narrow. They were locked in a permanent state of youth, exactly what the empire wanted. To the Ottoman elite, this was desirable. There was a fetishization of androgyny, the blending of boyish beauty with feminine grace. A eunuch did not represent a threat. He could not father children. He could not take a wife. And above all, he could not refuse his role. In the royal court, castrated boys filled many positions. Some became trusted guards. Others served the queen mother, the Valide sultan, in her private quarters. But the most prized, the most pampered, and the most controlled were those kept for entertainment. They were bathed in rose water, their eyebrows plucked into delicate arches, their clothes stitched from silk imported from Persia. They were turned into living ornaments. One Ottoman chronicler described a favored kek as more radiant than the moon, more graceful than the gazelle, and more silent than the tomb. That silence was not poetic, it was imposed. If a concubine spoke out of turn, he could be whipped. If he refused to dance, he could be starved. And if he tried to run, there was nowhere to go. The harem was sealed. The gates were watched. The city beyond had no name for him, only shame. Castration wasn't just about physical control. It was psychological, religious, economic. In a society where masculinity was tied to dominance, land, and lineage, the eunuch was nothing. He owned no property. He left no descendants. He could not inherit. He had no tribe to claim him. And yet these boys were at the center of court life, invisible, but always present, decorated, but never free. They were made into eternal children, not to preserve their innocence, but to ensure their obedience. When most people hear the word harem, images of women draped in silk, adorned with jewels, and whispering secrets come to mind. But the Ottoman harem was far more complex and far darker than these fantasies suggest. Within its walls lived not only women, but male concubines, eunuchs, and young dancers whose lives were governed by strict rules and rigid hierarchy. The male harem was a world of paradox, luxurious and brutal, opulent and oppressive. The boys who were chosen as kek or palace servants were kept in quarters separated from the women, yet their lives were deeply entwined with the power struggles of the court. Imagine a small chamber lined with cushions and heavy drapes, perfumes thick in the air, soft light filtering through lattice windows, music playing in the distance. Yet this softness was a mask. The boys were constantly watched. They were forbidden to leave their quarters without permission. Their every movement was observed by eunuchs, some loyal, some cruel, who enforced silence and obedience. The rules were unyielding. No speaking unless spoken to. No touching each other. No laughter that drew attention. Many boys suffered loneliness that no riches could cure. Their youth stolen, their families lost. They were trapped in gilded cages. But the rules were not only about control, they also reflected a hierarchy within the harem. At the top were the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, and the Sultan himself. Below them, the senior wives and concubines. And among the male servants, a strict ranking determined by age, favor, and usefulness. The youngest and most beautiful dancers were prized above all. They were given fine clothes and allowed to mingle at select court events. Older, less favored boys were relegated to menial tasks or punished. Punishment was harsh. A slip of the tongue, a forbidden glance, or a failed dance could bring lashes, starvation, or worse, And despite the lavish surroundings, the threat of violence was never far. There are accounts of boys being locked in dark rooms for days, of others being beaten with chains or thrown into cold baths as punishment. The silence was the loudest command of all. It was said the Kek learnt early that their voices were less valuable than their bodies. They became objects to be admired, used, and discarded. At the heart of the male concubine's life was the dance, a performance both beautiful and disturbing. The Kek were dancers trained not just in art, but in seduction. Clad in vibrant silks that shimmered in the flickering candlelight, they swayed with deliberate grace. Every movement, hips shaking, fingers fluttering, eyes locked on the audience, was designed to captivate. Their dances were sensual, erotic, and unapologetically meant to provoke desire. The audience was almost always male sultans, pashas, high-ranking officials, men who held immense power and wealth. To them, the Kek were not just entertainers, but symbols of prestige and indulgence. Music filled the air, lutes, drums, and the haunting notes of the ney flute. The rhythm quickened, and the boys moved faster, their bodies twisting and turning in ways that were both hypnotic and unsettling. Yet beneath the dazzling performances lay a darker reality. Many dancers were just children, some as young as 10 or 12. They performed night after night, expected to please without complaint. The dances often blurred the lines between art and exploitation. The boys were dressed in feminine clothing, makeup enhancing their features, their movements exaggerated to heighten their androgyny. This was no accident. The Ottoman court prized this ambiguity of body that was both male and female, innocent and provocative. It was a dangerous balance. After performances, the boys were often subject to unwanted attention, touches, advances, and worse. Some were gifted to powerful men as tokens of favor or tools of pleasure. If a dancer resisted or aged out of favor, he could be dismissed, sometimes violently. The famous traveler Evliya Elebi described scenes where jealous patrons fought over dancers, knives drawn, blood spilled. These weren't mere shows, they were performances of power. Through the Kek, the empire expressed its control over bodies, gender, and desire. In the vast Ottoman palaces, power was not just wielded through armies or decrees, it was exercised through control of bodies. And few bodies were more controlled, more objectified than those of the Kek. The sultans, pashas, and higher officials didn't simply want dancers. They wanted possessions, living trophies of their status and dominance. These boys were gifted as rewards to favored courtiers. They were sometimes kept as personal servants or secret lovers. Though officially forbidden from full sexual relations, the reality was often murkier. What exactly happened behind closed doors remains difficult to document. Official records are silent, and travelers' accounts are often vague or euphemistic. But the whispered stories paint a grim picture. Many Kek were sexually abused. Others were expected to fulfill desires they barely understood. Their bodies belonged to the men who bought or claimed them. Some sultans became obsessed with their favorite dancers, lavishing them with jewelry, rich clothes, and expensive gifts. Yet these same favorites were often isolated, separated from others, forbidden from forming bonds, and watched constantly by eunuchs. If a Kek displeased his master, punishment was swift and brutal. Beatings, starvation, or worse awaited those who resisted or failed to entertain. The demand for perfection was endless. Boys who aged, lost their beauty, or fell ill were cast aside without mercy. Behind the silk and song was a cold reality. These boys were both cherished and disposable. Their humanity was ignored, replaced by their function as objects of pleasure and status. The beauty and allure of the Kek drew crowds not only inside palace walls, but also throughout Ottoman cities. These boys performed in public festivals, bazaars, and taverns where their dances could ignite passions and violence alike. The allure of their androgynous beauty, their sensual movements, stirred intense feelings, desire, jealousy, obsession. Men fought over their favors, sometimes with deadly consequences. Accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries tell of brawls breaking out among patrons, knives drawn and blood spilled over dancers. One traveler described how, after a particularly captivating performance, The crowd surged forward like a tide, and swords flashed in the sunlight. The boys themselves were often powerless to stop the chaos. Sometimes they were caught in the middle of fights, injured or even abducted by rival groups. Ottoman authorities recognized the problem. At various points, they attempted to ban kek dancing in public places, fearing the disorder it caused. Yet the demand never vanished. For the boys, this meant constant danger, not just from their masters, but from the very crowds that adored them. Jealousy led to violence. Desire bred resentment, and the kek lived forever on the edge of chaos. Behind the velvet curtains and polished marble floors, a different kind of power ruled the Ottoman harem, the black eunuchs. These men, themselves once castrated slaves, held the keys to the palace's most secret chambers. Unlike the kek, the eunuchs were often older, greyer, and far more feared. They were the palace's enforcers, keepers of order, watchers of silence. The black eunuchs controlled access to the Sultan's family quarters and the private lives of everyone inside. They oversaw the movements of the concubines and dancers, including the kek. Their word was law. For the boys, the eunuchs were both protectors and jailers. They shielded them from outside threats, but also enforced harsh discipline. If a dancer broke a rule or tried to escape, the eunuchs delivered punishment, often brutal. Many eunuchs were rumored to relish their authority, wielding it with cruelty. They were tasked with erasing individuality, breaking spirits to ensure obedience. They patrolled the halls day and night, their presence a constant reminder of control. Yet eunuchs themselves lived lives of confinement. Having lost their manhood, they were neither fully free nor fully accepted. They slept in small chambers near the harem, lived apart from the rest of society, and could marry or have families only under strict conditions. In many ways, their existence was a mirror of the kek. Trapped bodies, silenced voices, and lives defined by others. Together, they formed the invisible web that held the Ottoman court's darkest secrets. Despite their presence in the heart of the empire, the lives of the kek and male concubines have been largely erased from history. They had no names in the grand archives, no monuments, no memoirs. Most historical records mention them only in passing descriptions from foreign travelers or brief notes in palace ledgers. Why? Because these boys were seen as property, not people. Their identities were stripped away as part of their function. In a society obsessed with lineage, honor, and male power, they represented what could not be spoken. Their very existence challenged rigid ideas about gender, sexuality, and power. And so, to preserve the empire's image, their stories were buried. This silence continues to the present day. Historians have struggled to uncover the truth. Fragments exist: letters, poems, court records, but no full picture emerges. We rely on the writings of outsiders, European diplomats and travelers who viewed the kek through exoticizing or moralizing lenses. This makes it difficult to hear the boys' own voices. But by piecing together these fragments, we begin to glimpse the lives behind the glitter. Lives of pain and survival, of beauty and violence, of silence and resistance. The story of the kek is a story of beauty and brutality intertwined, a mirror reflecting the contradictions of empire. For centuries, these boys lived in a world where their bodies were both treasured and broken. They entertained sultans and pashas, performed for crowds, and were symbols of wealth and power. Yet they were also silenced, controlled, and discarded. Their suffering is often hidden behind the gold threads of their costumes and the glitter of their dances. Today, as we look back, it is easy to romanticize the past or dismiss it as a strange cultural practice. But the truth is far more complex and far more human. These were children taken from homes, mutilated, forced into lives of servitude and spectacle. Their stories remind us how easily power can corrupt, and how often the most vulnerable pay the price. Remembering them means more than acknowledging cruelty. It means recognizing resilience. The kek survived in shadows, their lives erased, but their presence undeniable. In telling their story, we give voice to the voiceless. We shine light into the dark corners of history, because history is not just about kings and empires. It is about those who lived, suffered, and survived behind the scenes. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones no one wanted to tell. Thank you for listening to this journey into a hidden world. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share. There are many forgotten histories still waiting to be told.